Hello, welcome back. I hope you're refreshed. At the end of the first part, I finished by telling you that Fergus was nearly 20 before I was conscious that his access to the world was limited to the reach of his fingertips. This meant that touch, or the tactile modality, was absolutely crucial to Fergus for his communication, orientation within the environment, and his access to information about the world around him. So, I was talking about what I needed to understand, and the next thing I needed to understand was the vital importance of touch. Slide, please. As babies, my other children knew I was there because they could see and hear me. If Fergus couldn't feel me, then he was alone. To my regret, I would put him down safely in his Moses basket or on a play mat. Slide. Or in the special chair provided by physiotherapy to get on with jobs around the house, thinking I was reassuring him by my voice and the sight of me as I moved around. Next slide, please. But without my touch, he was marooned on an island of isolation. I hadn't used a sling with my other boys, so it didn't occur to me to use one with Fergus. I didn't understand why he seemed to cry far more than my other boys had. Because Fergus has hypertonia, that is, he was very floppy, I did hold him much more than my other babies, but not enough for a child who experiences the world through the bodily tactile modality of touch, movement, and so on. I was unwittingly limiting his access to information about the world he'd been born into. My instincts told me things were different, but I had no idea why. What I needed to understand, slide, was Fergus's perspective on the world. Next slide. My son's primary means of receiving information about the world he had entered was not through vision and hearing, but through touch, taste, movement, smell, pressure, vibration, air movement, muscle tension, temperature, and probably others I've left out. Here are some examples of what I was failing to see and understand. Slide. What I saw when we were on holiday was my son really excited to be on the beach. What I failed to see was him getting information and understanding and delighting in his surroundings through the grittiness of the sand against his skin, the firmness of the beach as he bounced up and down on his legs, the warmth of the sun on his body, the taste of sand and salt in his mouth, the smell of the salty air, the tension in his muscles as he reached out, the air movement created by himself as he moved, the shadows created as he waved his arms around, the temperature of the sand compared with the temperature of the air, and probably loads more. I recognized his pure, unadulterated joy at being on the beach, but I didn't know how to use this to help him to develop his communication. In short, I didn't know how to listen to him or how to help him talk to me using his bodily tactile perspective of the world. If I had understood, I would have taken buckets full of sand and bottles of seawater home so that we could talk about our day through Fergus's experience of it. Next slide. Here, I initially saw my son at risk of choking or poisoning himself by eating a leaf. Then I noticed he was pressing it against his lips and mouth, but not trying to eat it. I had no idea why, but was curious about it. I now know that he was finding out more about the bush as his eyes and ears weren't giving him enough information. Again, taste, pressure, touch, temperature, texture. Had I understood, I would have taken a few leaves home so that we could talk about the bush later from his perspective. Fergus used his tongue to supplement his impaired vision and hearing from when he was a tiny baby. Whenever close enough, he would lick my eyes and other parts of my face. I didn't know why and just thought it a bit odd. He was, in fact, getting to know my face. I very quickly stopped wearing makeup. Next slide. This photo shows Fergus aged about 21. He's on this particular roundabout for the first time. Fergus is again using his tongue to supplement the little information that's available to him through vision and hearing, something he still does to this day. By luck, we kept 2 big speakers from the hi-fi on the floor in the living room. Fergus's favourite music at the time seemed to be the rousing sound of a full Scottish pipe band. He would always move himself to where you could feel the vibrations from the speaker most strongly. Again, I had no idea why. I just thought it was one of the cute things he did. With knowledge and understanding of what I was seeing, I could have made Fergus's world a much richer and more meaningful place. Slide. So I needed an understanding of the importance and function of other senses for a child with congenital deafblindness. Next slide. I then needed to know how to use this knowledge to modify the way I did things so that all my actions and communications were meaningful to Fergus. I needed to meet him in his world, not to try to drag him into mine. Slide. Fergus has a little residual vision and hearing. In Fergus's early and primary school years, I knew about Fergus's physical impairment of vision and hearing, but what I was being told by the ophthalmology and audiology consultants didn't match what I was observing. I therefore needed information about how his vision and hearing were affected functionally. Things like how cerebral visual impairment works, the importance of good contrast, the effectiveness of certain colours over others. Luckily, I've always preferred bold, bright colours, as you might be able to tell. Pastel shades were no use to Fergus whatsoever. The impact of background noise, how auditory processing disorder works, and so on. Again, if I did get it right, it was luck, not judgment, that played its part here. Next slide. I needed to know how best to support Fergus's little bit of residual vision and hearing through his other senses, primarily touch. I lived in a world of not understanding, not knowing, feeling that support offered was inappropriate, but not knowing why. Trying to trust the professionals while knowing instinctively that many of them were getting it wrong for Fergus. Asking questions, but the wrong questions, and building a reputation, slide, for being uncooperative, difficult, and a problem parent. Fergus, meanwhile, was adrift in a world that didn't understand him. For example, one specialist support organisation told me that Fergus couldn't attend their events without me because they hadn't got the expertise to support him, even as a teenager where other young people were leaving mum at home. As I said earlier, I had education professionals repeatedly telling me his sight's not that bad, despite the detailed reports from the ophthalmology consultant. One day, I was summoned to school because of what staff interpreted as over-sexualised behaviour. Apparently, Fergus kept grabbing out at the T-shirt of a learning support assistant and pulling it down to reveal her chest. What was actually happening was that Fergus was kept out of reach of others because of assessments of so-called challenging behaviour. As a result, if a staff member came close, he would reach out to touch her. Because his sight was so limited, he aimed for the distinct line where the neck of her low-cut black T-shirt contrasted with her pale skin, because that's what he could see. With the label challenging behaviour attached to Fergus in secondary school, risk assessments led to him being supported one-to-one by staff in school and at youth club, but being kept out of reach of peers. Outside the home, Fergus was living in a world where he was isolated, lonely, desperately trying to make himself understood but not being listened to, and being constantly misunderstood. When he was about 15, 16, 17, the behavioural team was heavily involved in his support network. Discussions were being had about whether Fergus's so-called behaviour was so out of control that he might end up in a locked ward of a psychiatric unit. This filled me with absolute horror. It was a nightmare beyond comprehension, and I felt completely helpless and ineffectual in my efforts to help my child. I knew he needed a completely different approach, but I didn't know what shape that would take. Next slide. So how did I come to the realization of the need for tactile language or communication? In 2015, when Fergus was approaching the age of 18, the 16th Deafblind International World Conference was held in Romania. Sense in England decided they wanted to sponsor a parent to attend. I submitted an application and was lucky enough to be one of 2 parents selected. That conference blew my mind. I suddenly felt as though I had discovered a world where Fergus fitted. He was part of this world, not an outsider. I went to a presentation by Annika Johannesson from Norway and spent most of it with tears running down my face. For the first time ever, I heard someone describing a young man who reminded me of Fergus. And then I went to another presentation where a Danish colleague spoke about a man she supported. Again, I was reminded of Fergus. After nearly 18 years, I had finally found people like my son. But not only that, I was hearing about the importance of touch and communication using the tactile modality. I was also seeing and meeting people with deafblindness from all over the world who were, successfully interacting with each other using the tactile modality. They were active communicators, next slide, with agency, as they participated fully in not only the conference itself, but the shared, joyful, exciting experience of all who had come together in Bucharest from the 4 corners of the world. I understood very quickly that tactile communication was an enormous key that could unlock Fergus's world. I needed to know more. I needed to tell the people who supported Fergus. I knew I had to educate myself so that I could play my part in turning Fergus's world around. So began the hunt for the information I needed. So how did I go about finding that information? I went back to the UK and spoke to teachers, speech and language therapists, anyone who would listen, about my conviction that tactile communication was what Fergus needed and what little I understood about it, which wasn't very much at all at that point. No one in his school or youth club had heard of tactile communication. That's not necessarily the same all over the UK. I think there's a certain amount of postcode lottery as to what expertise is available in any particular area. At the Deafblind International Conference, I had also heard about specialist training in Canada for supporting people with deafblindness. And this was called intervener training. I discovered there was a much shorter version of it available to professionals in the UK. I found a course and managed to persuade the person running it to allow me to join, despite the fact that I was just a mum. All the other attendees were professionals from over the region. From then, I read what I could find, which was fairly limited at the time. Professionals in Fergus's support network were still not convinced by this newfangled odd approach. They were still trying to use the same old approaches and were still meeting with the same lack of success as they had for years. They were all approaches that were suitable if you had good functional vision and or hearing, but not for someone with congenital deafblindness. By coincidence, a few months after the intervener course, in November 2016, a conference was being held at Groningen University in the Netherlands for alumni and professionals to celebrate 10 years of the Masters in Communication and Deafblindness. A friend gave me Marlene Janssen's contact details, and I wrote asking if I could come along. With her legendary warmth and hospitality, she welcomed me. It was another mind-blowing experience. I loved every minute and knew I wanted to become part of this world full of people whose life work was to understand people like my son and find ways of improving his life and that of others like him. Then finally in 2018, I enrolled myself on the Masters in Communication and Deafblindness course at Groningen University. At each step of the way, I went back to the network supporting Fergus with what I had learned, but it was still falling on deaf ears. Excuse the very bad pun. People around him seemed unable to take Fergus's perspective as a person with congenital deafblindness. And most importantly, they still weren't seeing his bodily gestures and movements as communication, and so they weren't listening to him. His movements and gestures and actions continued to be viewed as behaviour, not communication, despite my best efforts to share the knowledge I was acquiring. An example was repeated attempts to teach Fergus a tactile version of the word finish or finished. When Fergus was about 18 or 19 and in school, when he was about 21 and in college, and when he was about 24 and in a different college. Different teachers and speech and language therapists told me proudly that they were teaching Fergus a tactile sign using hand-under-hand support for the word finished. It involved supporting Fergus's hands and getting him to follow as they performed a movement in which they crossed his hands and then opened them in a sweeping movement. All were delighted because he cooperated with hand-under-hand support when the activity was finished. All also reported that he never performed the sign unprompted or unsupported. This was interpreted as Fergus's inability or slowness to learn. As each new team announced that this was what they were working on, I would ask, why? Over the years, from an early age, I had heard professionals around Fergus say, "Oh, have you finished, Fergus?" as he span his body around from the activity, or moved one arm in a sweeping motion as he turned his body in the other direction, or he pushed the object away, or just picked up his favourite toy bears, or simply got up and walked away. Fergus already had multiple ways of saying finished very effectively in ways that were clearly understood using his preferred bodily tactile communication. He never used the imposed sign for finished because he didn't need it. Sadly, the professionals were so busy trying to impose communication strategies from their hearing and sighted world that they didn't stop and listen to what Fergus was already saying to them loud and clear. Another example of professionals around Fergus not listening to him and not listening to what I had to share with them is connected with Fergus's assessment of so-called challenging behaviour. This is not the current term, but it was the term used at the time. As I said earlier, it became so severe that Fergus was in serious danger of a long-term hospital placement. When in extreme distress, Fergus would rip off his glasses and punch himself repeatedly in the eyes. This actually led to him detaching retinas in both eyes. The distress could be physical pain, discomfort, thirst, being too hot, and so on. Or it could be emotional distress if something upset him, frightened him, overwhelmed him, confused him, and so on. As I began to understand more about the communication of people living with congenital deafblindness, I slowly came to a realization about how this serious self-injurious behaviour had come about. As a young child, Fergus had been taught the Magaton sign for food, which is made by bringing the fingers of the right hand together and tapping them against the side of the mouth. Fergus didn't have the fine motor skills to do that, so he used a closed fist. He would tap gently to indicate he wanted food. He gradually started using it for more food, or then more of anything, and eventually helped me with whatever he needed. He had generalized the meaning of the sign in the same way that a verbal child might generalize the word dog. The child would learn the word dog and then for a while call every animal dog. I remember a visit to Edinburgh Zoo where one of my granddaughters, she was about a year old at the time and starting to talk, where she had had a great time at the zoo spotting black and white striped dogs, dogs with enormous long necks, dogs with shaggy manes, dogs swinging through branches, dogs with long tails leaping around carrying babies in their pouches. There were dogs in every enclosure. And this is what Fergus did to this sign. It became help me with whatever was relevant to him at that moment. As time went on, Fergus would use this sign, as I say, to ask for help with anything. If support staff missed the sign, he would repeat it. If they missed it again, he would then tap against his temple, first with one hand and then harder with both clenched fists. If he still didn't get the help he needed and had become distressed, he would then throw his glasses off and punch himself repeatedly in the eyes. Fergus learned very quickly that this got him attention. Staff would dive on him and try to restrain him, using words like, "Stop, hands down, no, don't do that." These communicative actions were Fergus's way of gradually, and sometimes not so gradually, asking for help with a louder and louder voice. Unfortunately, because it was looked at as behaviour, not communication, the response was to try and stop him. It was the same as telling a verbal child to shut up, stop talking. I realised quite early that Fergus was trying to communicate through these at times self-injurious actions. Now, if I see his gestures in the first stages as he taps the side of his mouth, I respond with, "Can I help you? What's the problem?" or something similar. Fergus understands immediately that he's got my attention, that I'm listening, and that I'm trying to help him. Living in a care home, it requires busy support staff to be alert and vigilant and on the lookout for Fergus's bodily tactile communication at all times. And frustratingly, even now, I still have difficulty being listened to and taken seriously by professionals around Fergus as he tries to communicate with the people around him. The issue of being taken seriously and believed by professionals has been going on since Fergus was a baby. For years, I would participate in meetings with education staff, speech and language therapists, behavioural therapists, occupational therapists, social workers, and many other professionals. They would all tell me, "You know your son best." And then, when the minutes of the meeting were issued, my input wouldn't even be recorded, let alone acted upon. The issues were, slide please. I was mum, not a professional. Next slide. Research carried out by Rosemary van den Bremer in Norway has revealed that family knowledge has got very low status and is therefore not taken seriously. And this is a global problem. Next slide. I did not have the language of the professionals, so was speaking as an outsider, not one of the inner circle, to be taken seriously as having something worthwhile and useful to contribute. Next slide. But over time, as my use of language changed, my input was actually listened to and received more favourably. And then another issue started to emerge. As my knowledge increased, along with my ability to express myself in professional terms, next slide, I was then perceived as a threat. Even now, I struggle to get the professionals around Fergus to listen to me and to implement appropriate approaches to support Fergus as a person with congenital deafblindness in a sighted and hearing world. The issue of taking parents seriously is, in my experience, still a big problem, despite legislation, guidelines, organisational protocols, and so on. I've spoken about this and other similar problems to a number of different organisations and have been told several times that X, Y, or Z doesn't or would never happen here. My experience tells me otherwise. As I said earlier, I eventually enrolled on the Masters in Communication and Deafblindness course. It made absolute sense to use the experiences I had had in my studies. Next slide. So, I want to share now, how did these experiences inform and lead me into my research journey, and how did they influence my research? As part of my master's degree in communication and deafblindness, I had to do a research project. Even before I started the master's programme, I knew I had to do something that would improve the quality of my son's life. Otherwise, what was the point of it all? My research topic was an intervention designed to minimise the risks of social isolation and loneliness in people with congenital deafblindness. Fergus is a very sociable young man. For his 18th birthday, we wanted to invite his friends to join us for a celebration. We approached the leader of his youth club, a person who had known him for 15 years, and were told he has no friends, he just does his own thing. The The support workers who delivered this information accepted the situation as normal and expressed no expectation that it could or should be any different. I was devastated. I had assumed that my sociable, fun-loving son had a group of friends like any other young man of his age. This heartbreaking information instantly raised the question of how this had come about. How had this sociable young man, who had spent 16 years attending educational and social settings where I had expected daily opportunities for participation to be provided, how had he ended up being socially isolated from his peers? This was the first hint that the future I had imagined for my son as an active participant in a wide and varied social circle of friends was far from certain. I knew I had to do my best to change this. During the master's programme, I also did an investigation into the assessment processes that my son has been through throughout his life. It was very revealing in that it helped me understand the origins of the perceptions which professionals had of my son and of their predictions of his long-term outcomes. My experiences have made me determined that any work I engage in has to be for the purpose of improving the quality of life for my son and others like him. Next slide. Reflecting on my experiences as the mother of a young man living with congenital deafblindness, I'd like to finish by telling you what I would say to professionals in the field, first of all. Next slide. I would say to professionals, take parents seriously. They may not have the right vocabulary. They may be so physically and emotionally caught up in the reality of having a child with congenital deafblindness and other complex needs that they cannot articulate easily and clearly, but they really are the experts on their child. Professionals see the child maybe once a week, if that, unless they're actually the class teacher. The parents are there 24/7. Treat parents with respect, not just verbally. Don't just pay lip service to it, but believe it. Believe the respect you owe those parents. Take nothing for granted. Look past the public facade put on for your visit. Try to put yourself in their shoes. Take the perspective of the parent. Make no assumptions. Consider how you differentiate between what you consider to be the knowledge of professionals and what you think a parent needs to know. Parents probably need to know more than you realise. Treat parents as genuinely equal partners within that child support network and work with them in true collaboration. If a parent questions, welcome it with cooperation, not judgment. Receive every morsel of information from parents about their child as a gift to be valued, cherished, explored as a piece of the key that will help unlock that child's world. And what would I say to other parents? Next slide, please. Dare to challenge. Those professionals in their real or imagined white coats or uniforms are just people. They don't know everything, and they can learn so much from you. Dare to ask questions. Why, when, who, what, where? Even if you think you know the answer, ask. There's no such thing as a stupid question. Trust your instincts. If it doesn't seem right, then it probably isn't. And if it turns out it is right, then you will have had confirmation of that. Demand explanation and clarification. Don't be fobbed off. If something isn't clear, ask again. I know all this is easier said than done sometimes, but I always think, if I don't fight for my son, who will? Demand training, information, knowledge. It's your right to be given the skills to communicate effectively with your child and to enable and empower your child as he or she goes out into the world. Next slide. You are truly the expert on your child. Believe in what your child is telling you and believe in yourself. Next slide. Finally, way back in 1597, Francis Bacon, an English philosopher, said, "Knowledge itself is power." 400 years later, Kofi Annan, Secretary General of the United Nations, between 1997 and 2006, took this further by saying, slide, knowledge is power, information is liberating, education is the premise of progress in every society, in every family. As families of children with dual sensory impairments strive to meet their children in their world of deafblindness, the gift of knowledge, information, and education will empower these families in the face of opposition and diversity. As practitioners in the world of deafblindness, the knowledge that families can bring will educate and inform, thus enriching their expertise and practice as they support people with deafblindness. Working together, families and practitioners in the field of deafblindness will become empowered to unlock the door of bodily tactile communication and cast light into an otherwise dark world of potential isolation and loneliness. Next slide. Thank you.